There's a line on this planet that has been completely silent for 326 years. It runs for 700 miles along the edge of a continent, longer than the distance from London to Berlin, and it passes within 100 miles of more than 10 million people. Most of them drive over its shadow every day. Most of them have never heard its name. It is not a border. It is not a road. It is a place, deep underground, where one piece of the Earth's crust is being forced beneath another, slowly, patiently, at about the speed your fingernails grow. And here is the thing you need to understand about that silence. The last time this line made a sound, it did so for 4 to 6 minutes straight. It dropped entire forests into salt water. It sent a wave across an ocean that flooded villages 4,500 miles away, in a country that had no idea why the sea had suddenly risen on a calm, windless night. That was 326 years ago. It has not spoken since, until yesterday. Yesterday, a magnitude 5.5 earthquake struck 218 kilometers off the coast of Oregon, right at the edge of this line. Nobody was hurt. Nothing was damaged. The alert level stayed green the entire time. And yet, within hours, scientists from Northern California to British Columbia were looking at the same data and asking the same quiet question. Because the official odds of a major rupture on the southern stretch of this fault, the exact stretch where yesterday's earthquake happened, are 1 in 3, not 1 in 3,000, not 1 in 300, 1 in 3. Within the lifetime of most people watching this is the story of the Cascadia subduction zone. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand 4 things. First, what actually broke offshore yesterday and why it's probably not what you think. Second, what a magnitude 9 rupture would actually do to Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver minute by minute. Third, the detective story of how scientists reconstructed the exact night this fault last ruptured, using evidence from 3 different continents and a tree that died in the winter of 1700. And fourth, the part almost nobody is talking about, why the researchers who study this fault are more worried about its silence than they would be about its shaking. Stick around, because once you understand what's loading beneath the Pacific Northwest, you will never look at a quiet week the same way again. What actually happened? Let's start with yesterday, because the details here matter more than you'd expect. And the difference between panic and understanding lies entirely in those details. Yesterday morning, just before noon, Universal Time, the ground moved off the Oregon coast. The earthquake struck about 135 miles west of the small town of Bandon, out in deep water, far beyond the sight of land. It hit roughly 10 kilometers down, about the cruising altitude of a passenger jet, but in the opposite direction. In earthquake terms, that counts as fairly shallow. Magnitude 5.5, to put that in perspective, the planet produces over 1,000 earthquakes of this size every single year. In just the 7 days surrounding this one, more than 100 quakes worldwide hit magnitude 4.5 or higher. Statistically, an event like this is background noise. It's the Earth clearing its throat. No damage was reported. Nobody was hurt. On its own, this was a non-event. So why did people from Northern California to British Columbia suddenly feel genuinely uneasy? 2 reasons. The first is location. That patch of ocean floor doesn't sit in the middle of nowhere. It sits at the doorstep of the most closely watched fault system in North America. The second reason is stranger. People felt this earthquake in Victoria, British Columbia, over 370 miles north of the epicenter. Think about what that means. That's roughly the distance from New York City to Pittsburgh. For a moderate offshore quake to be felt across that distance, its energy had to travel clean and efficiently through solid, unbroken crust. Not through crumbly, fractured rock that absorbs and scatters seismic waves, through rock that transmits them like a struck bell. A bell only rings like that when it's solid, and a fault zone only transmits energy like that when it's locked. Hold on to that word, locked. It's the single most important word in this entire story, and we're going to come back to it. The machine under the sea. Here's what you're actually dealing with when you talk about Cascadia. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, a slab of ocean floor called the Juan de Fuca Plate is being forced underneath the North American continent. This is called subduction, and it is the most powerful geological process on Earth. Every earthquake in recorded history that exceeded magnitude 9, every single one, happened at a subduction zone. Chile in 1960, Alaska in 1964, Sumatra in 2004, Japan in 2011. The Cascadia subduction zone runs about 700 miles from Cape Mendocino in Northern California, past Oregon, past Washington, all the way to the northern tip of Vancouver Island. Along that entire stretch, the ocean plate slides beneath the continent at about 2 inches per year. That's it, 2 inches. The speed your hair grows in a year? That sounds harmless. It is not, and here's why. Deep down, 30, 40, 50 kilometers below the surface, the rock is hot enough to be slightly soft, and the plates slide past each other more or less continuously. But near the surface, in the top 20 kilometers or so, The rock is cold and brittle, and the two plates are not sliding at all. They are stuck. Friction has welded them together across a contact area of tens of thousands of square miles. So picture the system. The deep part of the plate keeps moving forward, 2 inches a year, every year without fail. The shallow part refuses to move. Something has to give, and what gives is the rock itself. The edge of the North American continent is literally being compressed and dragged downward, bending like a diving board with someone standing on the end. GPS stations along the coast can measure this happening. The coastline of Washington and Oregon is being squeezed eastward, millimeter by millimeter, year after year. Scientists watch it move in real time. Now do the math with me. 2 inches a year, locked for 326 years. That's over 50 feet of motion that should have happened, and hasn't. 50 feet of displacement, stored as elastic strain in solid rock, across a fault surface the size of a small country. When a fault stays quiet this long, that silence is not peace. It is a spring being compressed. And when the friction finally fails, when one small patch of that locked interface breaks loose and the rupture begins to race along the fault at 2 miles per second, all of that stored motion gets released at once. Not over years, not over days, over 4 to 6 minutes. Scientists expect that release to arrive at magnitude 9, not magnitude 7, magnitude 9. And this is where human intuition fails us completely, because the magnitude scale is logarithmic. A magnitude 9 is not a bit bigger than the 6.9 quake that hit San Francisco in 1989. It releases roughly 1,000 times more energy. It is not a bigger version of an earthquake you've experienced. It is a different category of event, the kind that reshapes coastlines. And a rupture like that doesn't just shake the ground. It moves the sea floor, vertically, across hundreds of miles, which means the ocean above it moves too. And a tsunami generated at Cascadia could reach the nearest beaches in as little as 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That's less time than the average person spends deciding what to watch tonight. The twitch and the trigger. Now, here's where we need to slow down, because precision matters enormously here, and this is the part most headlines got wrong yesterday. Yesterday's earthquake almost certainly did not happen on the Cascadia Megathrust itself. The great locked interface we've been describing, at 10 kilometers deep and 218 kilometers offshore, it happened inside the oceanic plate, the slab that's being fed into the subduction zone. Think of the megathrust as the jaws of the machine, and yesterday's quake as a crack in the material being fed into those jaws. Earthquakes like that are common. The ocean plate is being bent and stressed as it approaches the trench, and it snaps internally all the time. There is a real, meaningful difference between the big one starting and the feeder plate simply twitching. Yesterday was clearly the second thing, not the first. The locked interface itself stayed put. It didn't slip a millimeter. If that's all you take away, you might feel reassured. You shouldn't be? Not entirely. Because here's the part that isn't fully comforting. The plate that cracked yesterday is the same plate that feeds pressure into the locked fault. Every stress adjustment in that slab is part of the same system that is loading Cascadia. So no, this wasn't the big one. It wasn't even the beginning of the big one. But it was a clear, measurable reminder that the system it belongs to is fully loaded, fully wound, and fully capable. The fault didn't speak yesterday. But something right next to it did, and it said, still here, still loading. The night we know by name. Now, let's rewind 3 centuries, because this is where the story becomes, honestly, one of the greatest detective stories in the history of science. We don't just know that Cascadia ruptured in the past. We know the exact date. We arguably know it to the hour. The evening of January 26th, 1700. Think about how strange that is. No European settler witnessed it. No instrument existed anywhere on Earth that could record it. The seismograph wouldn't be invented for another 175 years. The people who lived through it left no written records, because the nations of the Pacific Northwest coast kept their histories orally. And yet we know the date. Here's how. 3 completely independent lines of evidence, from 3 different kinds of witness, all converge on one single night. Witness number 1, Japan. In January 1700, along the northeastern coast of Japan, the sea rose without warning. Village records from the era, administrative logs kept by local officials, merchants, and magistrates described flooding that arrived in the night, damaged houses, ruined stored rice, and washed away buildings in specific coastal villages. The records are detailed, dated, and consistent across hundreds of miles of coastline. But here's what made those records a mystery for centuries. There was no earthquake in Japan that night. Nobody felt the ground move. In Japanese records, it became known as an orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent. 300 years later, researchers took those flood records, measured the wave heights they implied, calculated the size of the earthquake needed to produce them, and traced the wave backward across the Pacific. 10 hours of travel time at jet airliner speeds across open ocean. The trajectory pointed directly at the Pacific Northwest coast of North America. The size pointed at magnitude 9, And the timing, working backward from when the wave arrived in Japan, put the rupture at roughly 9 o'clock in the evening, Pacific time, January 26, 1700. A wave crossed the largest ocean on Earth, flooded villages in a country that had never heard of Oregon, and got written down by candlelight, and those documents became the timestamp for an American earthquake. Witness number 2, the trees. Along the coasts of Washington and Oregon, there are places where dead cedar trees stand in salt marshes like gray skeletons. Locals call them ghost forests. Western red cedars can live for 1,000 years, and these all died together, suddenly, at the same moment. Here's why. When the megathrust ruptured, the coastline itself dropped, in some places by 5 or 6 feet in a matter of minutes. Land that had been forest above the tide line was suddenly below it. Salt water flooded into the root systems, and the trees died where they stood. Cedar is remarkably rot-resistant, so the trunks survived. And trees keep calendars. Scientists took core samples and counted the rings. And the outermost ring, last season of growth those trees ever completed, dated to the growing season of 1699. They died in the winter between 1699 and 1700. The trees agree with Japan. Witness number 3, human memory. The indigenous nations of the Pacific Northwest coast have kept oral histories for thousands of years, and along the entire length of the Cascadia coast, across different nations, different languages, communities that had no contact with Japanese archives or tree ring laboratories, those histories describe the same event. A night in winter when the ground shook so hard people could not stand, and the sea withdrew and then rushed in, and entire villages were swept away. On Vancouver Island, the Hu-ai-at people tell of a village at Pachana Bay where everyone was lost in a single night. The wave came before anyone could flee. Stone, wood, and memory, a merchant's ledger in Japan, a tree ring in a Washington marsh, a story carried across 10 generations, 3 archives that had never met each other, all pointing to one night. That is not speculation, that is convergence, and it means the question about Cascadia has never been if. It is only, and has only ever been, when. The book on the seafloor, and it goes deeper than 1700, because scientists have reconstructed not just the last rupture, but 10,000 years of this fault's history, and they did it by reading the seafloor like a book. Here's the trick. When a great earthquake shakes the continental margin, it shakes loose enormous underwater landslides. Mud and sand cascade down submarine canyons and settle across the deep ocean floor in a distinct layer. Then centuries pass, normal sediment slowly buries it, and the next great quake lays down the next layer after layer, like pages. Researchers pulled core samples from the seafloor up and down the Cascadia margin and counted the pages. The record shows roughly 40 major earthquakes over the past 10,000 years, with about 10 of them rupturing the entire margin at once, end to end, the full magnitude 9 scenario. But the record shows something else, and this is the detail that should have your full attention. Not every rupture breaks the whole fault. Some break only a segment, and the southern third, the stretch off southern Oregon and northern California, ruptures more often than the rest. Its intervals between quakes are shorter. Its clock runs faster. That is the exact stretch of fault where yesterday's earthquake happened. This is where the official numbers come from, and they are worth saying slowly. For a full, margin-wide magnitude 9 rupture, the estimated odds are roughly 15% in the next 50 years, about 1 in 7. Already uncomfortable. But for the southern segment alone, the odds jump to roughly 1 in 3. 1 in 3 within 50 years. Those are not fringe numbers from a documentary. They are mainstream, peer-reviewed figures, and they are baked directly into the building codes of 3 states. Engineers in Oregon are legally required to design around this probability. The people who write construction law have already accepted what most of the public hasn't heard. Flip a coin twice. If it comes up heads both times, that's roughly the chance this doesn't happen in the next half century. 4 to 6 minutes. So let's get concrete. Let's talk about what a full rupture actually looks like on the ground. Not as an abstraction, but street by street, city by city. Because the phrase magnitude 9 doesn't mean anything until you translate it into minutes and miles. Start with the shaking itself. Most people picture an earthquake as 10 or 15 seconds of violence. That's what smaller quakes deliver. A magnitude 9 subduction rupture is different because the fault doesn't break all at once. The rupture front travels, unzipping 700 miles of fault, and the shaking continues the entire time it runs. 4 to 6 minutes. Stop and actually time that. 6 minutes is longer than most songs. Imagine the hardest shaking you can picture. And now imagine it simply refusing to stop. A minute in, 2 minutes in. Buildings that survive the first 30 seconds start to fail from fatigue, the way a paperclip snaps, not on the first bend, but the 20th. Unreinforced brick buildings, older bridges, highway overpasses built before modern codes. Up and down the coast, structures don't have to be weak to fail. They just have to be asked to endure something they were never designed to endure for 300 seconds straight. Then, before the dust settles, the second act. The seafloor has lurched, the ocean above it has been displaced, and the tsunami is already moving. For the outer coast, first waves arrive in as little as 15 minutes. Coastal towns will not get a leisurely evacuation. They will get the time it takes to walk, because driving may be impossible on buckled roads, from wherever they are standing to high ground. Emergency managers in Oregon and Washington teach a simple rule. The shaking is the warning. If the ground shakes for minutes near the coast, you don't wait for a siren. You move uphill immediately, and you keep moving. Then the third act, the one that lasts the longest and gets discussed the least: isolation. The coastal highway system crosses hundreds of bridges and unstable slopes. Modeling suggests roads would buckle and fracture in hundreds of places simultaneously. Whole 100-mile stretches of the coast could be physically unreachable by land for weeks. A senior FEMA official planning for this scenario once summarized the operating assumption in a single sentence. Everything west of Interstate 5 will be toast. That's not a YouTuber talking. That's the person whose job was to plan the response. Now the cities. Eureka, California, sits almost directly on top of the highest risk southern segment, the 1 in 3 stretch. For Eureka and the surrounding Humboldt coast, this isn't a distant statistic. It's the ground under the town. Older buildings there would take the hardest, longest shaking of anywhere in the zone. Portland, Oregon, sits about 70 miles inland, and people assume distance equals safety. It doesn't, not at this magnitude. Portland would still shake for 4 to 6 minutes. The city's specific nightmare is twofold. First, its stock of older unreinforced brick buildings, built decades before anyone knew this fault existed. Second, isolation. Portland is a city of bridges, and bridges are exactly what this kind of long-duration shaking punishes. And there's a detail worth knowing. Much of the region's liquid fuel supply sits in tank farms along the Willamette River, on soil that engineers classify as prone to liquefaction, where violent shaking makes waterlogged ground behave like a liquid. A city can survive shaking and still be paralyzed by what happens to its fuel, its bridges, and its supply lines afterward. Seattle is trickier still because Seattle lives with 2 separate threats stacked on top of each other: the distant Cascadia Megathrust and its own shallow local faults running directly beneath the city. This very week, and hold this thought because we're coming back to it, part of a quiet swarm of 3,000 deep tremor signals sat underneath Puget Sound. Seattle's exposure is specific: ferries that are lifelines, floating bridges that exist almost nowhere else on Earth, and old brick neighborhoods dense with people. A full Cascadia rupture would hit Seattle hard despite its distance from the open coast. Vancouver, British Columbia, sits near the fault's northern end. And if you think a tectonic plate respects an international border, remember, people in Victoria felt yesterday's little 5.5 from 370 miles away. A full rupture hits both countries. No passport required for the shaking. One clarification, because people constantly mix this up. Cascadia is not the San Andreas. The San Andreas is California's famous fault. It threatens San Francisco and Los Angeles, and it maxes out around magnitude 8. Cascadia is a subduction zone, a fundamentally different kind of machine, capable of a full magnitude 9, which, remember, releases many times more energy. 2 separate systems, 2 separate clocks. The famous one is not the biggest one. The signal nobody can feel. Now we get to the part of this story most people have never heard, and it's the part that changes how you should think about every quiet day in the Pacific Northwest. In the same week as that offshore quake, instruments along the fault picked up something called tectonic tremor. Over 7 days, monitoring networks logged around 3,000 separate tremor signals rippling beneath the surface. One single evening recorded over 500 slow-slip events happening deep underground. You cannot feel any of this. No human ever has. It's thousands of times too faint. It happens deep on the fault, well below the locked zone, down where the rock is warm enough to creep instead of snap. Down there, the plates slide in slow motion over hours and days instead of seconds, whispering out those thousands of signals as they go. Scientists only discovered this phenomenon in the early 2000s, and it turns out Cascadia does it on a schedule. Roughly every 14 months, a slow-slip episode sweeps through the deep fault. Japan sees the same thing. New Zealand sees it. It's become one of the most valuable stress gauges scientists have, a way of watching, in real time, how the deep fault is feeding the shallow one. And here's the mechanism you need to sit with. Every time the deep fault slips forward, it shoves its accumulated motion up-dip onto the shallow locked section. The locked zone doesn't move, it just absorbs the push. Each 14-month episode is another small tightening of the winch, another turn of the key. Most of this week's 3,000 signals sat under the same high-risk southern stretch we've been talking about. A smaller cluster lit up beneath Puget Sound near Seattle. Now, honesty matters here, so let's be precise. These tremor episodes are routine. They are not earthquake predictions. Nobody anywhere can look at this week's data and tell you when the big one arrives. It could be this decade. It could be 100 years from now. Anyone who tells you a date is lying to you. But this is the idea that flips ordinary earthquake intuition completely on its head, and it's the single most important thing in this video. We assume a quiet fault is a safe fault. At Cascadia, it is exactly the opposite. California's faults grumble constantly. Small quakes, frequent releases, pressure bleeding off in installments. Cascadia doesn't grumble. Cascadia is silent because Cascadia is locked. The deep fault slides forward every year. The shallow fault stores every inch of it. Silence here is not the absence of the threat. Silence is the threat, measured, accumulating, 326 years deep. A fault that rattles is a fault making payments. A fault that stays silent for 3 centuries is a fault whose entire debt comes due at once. Cascadia is not asleep. Cascadia is holding its breath. A loud week on the ring. Yesterday's quake didn't happen in isolation either. The entire Pacific Ring of Fire had a busy week, and one piece of it deserves more attention than the quake that actually made headlines. Alaska recorded its own magnitude 5.3 in the same zone that produced the 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake, a magnitude 9.2 that remains the second largest earthquake ever recorded on instruments, anywhere, ever. That's the neighborhood. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Philippines saw an earthquake swarm near the Manila Trench, a magnitude 5, plus several quakes above magnitude 4, packed into a few days. And here's the detail that matters. A normal cluster like that is usually explained by one clear main shock followed by aftershocks. This swarm had no main shock, just restlessness, the kind that usually fades to nothing, but occasionally precedes something larger. Why should you care about a trench on the other side of the ocean? Because the Manila Trench converges fast, and modeling puts its ceiling around magnitude 9.2, and its geometry is merciless. Tsunami waves could reach parts of Manila Bay in as little as 2 minutes. 2 minutes is not a warning window, it is nothing. And millions of people live along that coastline in some of the densest cities in Asia. Most swarms fade. This one probably will too, but stacked together, that trench may quietly be a bigger global risk than the quake that made this week's headlines. Now, the necessary cold water. That same week, the planet logged over 100 quakes at magnitude 4.5 or higher. It is tempting, deeply tempting, to feel like the Earth is coordinating something. It isn't. That's what a normal week on the Ring of Fire looks like statistically every week. There is no evidence connecting Oregon's 5.5 to Alaska or the Philippines. So skip the sunspot theories and the secret installation conspiracies circulating right now. The energies involved in those claims aren't remotely in the same universe as what loads a magnitude 9 fault. And the geomagnetic field actually stayed quiet that week, the opposite of what those theories require. Seismic data is public, open, and cross-checked by networks in dozens of countries. Nobody is hiding this from you. The truth is scarier than the conspiracies anyway, because the truth is that nobody is steering this at all. So what's actually worth your attention? Something far less dramatic than a conspiracy and far more useful, whether your household is ready, given odds of 1 in 3. The list is short. A go bag you could grab in 30 seconds. A family meeting point that everyone actually knows. Because cell networks may not survive the first hour. Several days of water and food, because help is coming and help can physically reach you, are different sentences when every bridge on the coastal highway is cracked. Strap the water heater and the tall furniture to the wall. Unsecured furniture causes an enormous share of earthquake injuries, and it's a $20 fix. Know your workplace's plan, not just your home's, because the fault doesn't check your schedule. And the one rule that outranks every siren and every app: if you are near the coast and the ground shakes hard for minutes, do not wait for confirmation. The shaking is the confirmation. Move to high ground on foot immediately. The West Coast's early warning system can buy you seconds, enough to drop, cover, and hold on. But for the tsunami, the ground itself is the only warning that arrives on time. None of this requires panic. It requires a plan you made once on a calm afternoon and never needed to think about again. That's the entire ask. And if you're watching from Kansas or London and thinking this isn't your story, the ports, highways, and supply chains along that 700-mile coastline feed a continental economy. A rupture there doesn't stay there. It arrives in everyone's prices, everyone's shipping delays, everyone's newsfeed for a year. There is no "not my coast" on an event this size. Step back one last time and look at the whole picture. A fault, 700 miles long, silent for 326 years. A ledger in Japan, a drowned forest, and a story told across 10 generations, all recording the last time it spoke. 50 feet of stored motion. A 1 in 3 number written into law by people who don't gamble. And a monitoring network listening, every 14 months, to the sound of the winch tightening, a sound no human being has ever felt. The hardest part of this story isn't that the warning is loud, it's that it's quiet. A 5.5 jolt offshore. A tremor nobody can feel. A swarm across the ocean with no main shock. If that's the level of signal we get, here's the question nobody on Earth can answer. How would we ever tell an ordinary quiet week from the very last one? We can't. That's the honest answer. Nature is not counting down for our benefit. It doesn't know we're watching. It just keeps adding pressure 2 inches a year the way it has for 3 centuries. Through the gold rush, through 2 world wars, through the invention of the seismograph, the satellite, and the smartphone, all of which arrived during one single interval of its silence. The only variable we control is the one that matters least to the fault and most to us. How ready we are when the interval ends. Yesterday, for a few minutes, the quietest fault in America spoke just loud enough to remind us it's still there. Still there. Still locked, still loading. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. Next time we're going deeper into the faults nobody's watching. And drop your city or region in the comments, especially if you're anywhere near the West Coast. Tell us where you're watching from, because we might cover your area's risk next. 326 years of silence. 1 in 3. 15 minutes to high ground. The question was never if. Make sure your answer to, were you ready, isn't silence too.